Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt, has been portrayed by Hollywood as an exotic beauty whose main claim to fame was her romantic entanglements with two Roman leaders, Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. But history shows that Cleopatra's story was much more complex than that. In fact, it was so complex that some historians even question whether Cleopatra ever looked Egyptian at all. Welcome to my channel. And today, let's find out who was Cleopatra and why is she still so famous. This is part 1 of our series on Cleopatra, where we will trace her ancestry all the way back to the earliest days of ancient Egypt. You won't want to miss it, so subscribe for new episodes every Wednesday. When Cleopatra took the throne of Egypt in 51 BC at the age of just 14, she had no idea how hard it would be to keep her seat. You see, Cleopatra was the daughter of Ptolemy XII, the previous pharaoh of Egypt, and his sister wife, Cleopatra V. But despite being the couple's only child, Cleopatra was not their heir apparent. Instead, their other daughter, Bernice IV, was next in line to inherit the throne because of her father's preference for male heirs. However, after Ptolemy XII passed away, Bernice IV declared herself the sole ruler of Egypt, forcing her younger sister Cleopatra into exile in Rome. Now, while this might seem like a clear-cut case of sibling rivalry, it was really just another example of how complicated Cleopatra's life would become. When Cleopatra was born in 69 BC, Egypt was technically a kingdom allied with Rome, and her family were clients of the Roman Republic, meaning they owed their position to Rome and had to follow its laws. The ruling dynasty of Ptolemies, which originated from one of Alexander the Great's generals, had long been in bed with Rome, and that meant that Cleopatra's childhood was heavily influenced by the Roman world. For example, Cleopatra was raised speaking Greek instead of Egyptian and was familiar with Roman culture and customs. Even more shockingly, Cleopatra's mother, Cleopatra V, was half Macedonian, the region where Alexander the Great had come from, and quarter Syrian. There is no evidence whatsoever that either parent was of Egyptian descent. And therefore, given the Ptolemaic dynasty had ruled over Egypt for 4 generations at this point, it's safe to say that Cleopatra wasn't really Egyptian either. At any rate, when Cleopatra was forced into exile in Rome at the tender age of 14, she and her younger brother Ptolemy XIII needed somewhere to stay. They were taken in by the wealthy heiress and former queen of the Neely clan, Servilus Caiaphas. Now, this lady was quite the character. You see, her father, Gaius Cassius Longinus, had been a Roman senator and military officer who led an unsuccessful revolt against Octavian, aka Augustus, who became the first emperor of Rome. After Cassius was defeated and killed in 32 BC, Servilia managed to negotiate a peace deal with Octavian, securing her family's wealth and safety. And she was known throughout Rome for her wit and vivacious nature. She had previously been married to Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, one of Caesar's triumvirs, but they divorced, and she later became the mistress of Julius Caesar. Historians believe that Servilia acted as a go-between for Caesar and Cleopatra, helping them meet for the first time when Cleopatra came to Rome to plead for her family's return to Egypt. As a result, Cleopatra was able to ingratiate herself to Caesar, and she spent several years living in Rome, learning the ways of the city, and solidifying her relationship with the great general. While there, Cleopatra gave birth to Caesarion, her son and Caesar's heir, which made him the first Egyptian male heir since Ptolemy XII. Finally, in 47 BC, Cleopatra and her brother were allowed back to Egypt. However, their return didn't go exactly as planned. Despite the fact that Bernice IV had clearly usurped the throne illegally, Rome did not support Cleopatra's claim. That was probably because Bernice had forged an alliance with Rome's most powerful man, Pompey the Great. But Cleopatra had her own ace up her sleeve. Remember how she had been in Rome for several years learning about politics and culture? Well, during her stay, she had become best friends with none other than Caesar's assassin, Marcus Junius Brutus. And so, when Caesar was murdered in 44 BC, Brutus sided with Cleopatra and helped her regain the throne of Egypt. Finally free to rule, Cleopatra went around strengthening alliances with other Mediterranean powers, while also giving birth to twins, a boy and a girl, with her brother Ptolemy. Now, despite what Hollywood would have you believe, the twins were not part of an incestuous relationship. Instead, the Ptolemaic dynasty had been practicing a form of cousin marriage for generations in order to keep their bloodline pure and their wealth within the family. At any rate, Cleopatra named her son Ptolemy XV and her daughter Cleopatra Selene, and the three of them ruled over Egypt until 41 BC, and now our story takes a turn toward the strange. See, in 48 BC, Rome had suffered a humiliating defeat at the hands of the king of Pontus, and in response, the Roman Senate had declared war on not just Pontus, but also on Cleopatra's Egypt. Why? Well, because Rome believed that Cleopatra had secretly allied herself with King Mithridates, the sixth of Pontus, and was cheating them out of their hard-earned tribute. Even though there was no evidence of an alliance between Egypt and Pontus, Rome was ready to crush Cleopatra. It seemed as though things were looking up for Cleopatra, though, because, as we mentioned earlier, she had befriended Caesar. So, naturally, when the Egyptians heard that Rome had declared war on Egypt, they assumed that Caesar would protect their queen. But sadly, that was not the case. In fact, Caesar didn't lift a finger to help Cleopatra. He even confiscated some of her treasure, which he used to pay for his campaigns in Spain. This left Cleopatra with no choice but to flee to the kingdom of Bithynia and ask for troops to defend her homeland. However, it was in Bithynia where Cleopatra met the man who would change the course of her life forever. You see, while Caesar had failed to support Cleopatra, another Roman leader had stepped in to take her side, none other than the great general and future emperor of Rome, Mark Antony, and the two instantly fell in love. Actually, that's not true. We don't have any evidence that Cleopatra and Antony fell in love. What we do know is that they formed a powerful alliance. Cleopatra sent Antony 3 ships to help him defeat his enemies in Bithynia. Then she joined him in Athens to celebrate his victory and show off her power. Together, they paraded through the streets in golden chariots, all the while wearing traditional Egyptian clothing. They then traveled to Alexandria, where Cleopatra hosted a massive banquet for Antony and his army. And it was here that Cleopatra showed the world that she was much more than just a pretty face. You see, according to Roman historian Plutarch, Cleopatra surprised everyone in attendance by entering the banquet in the form of the goddess of the Nile. But what does that mean? Well, her entry was preceded by a procession of women dressed as reeds, pomegranates and lilies, all symbols of the Nile River, and eventually a barge shaped like a flower arrived carrying Cleopatra. Garlands of flowers adorned the barge along with incense-burning altars, and she wore a headdress that depicted the mythical progenitor of the Nile River, the goddess Nephthys. So why did Cleopatra make such a grand entrance? Well, she wanted to impress Mark Antony, of course, but she also wanted to remind the assembled Romans that she was descended from the gods, just like the Egyptians believed. Cleopatra knew that if she could convince the Romans that she was a literal descendant of the gods, then they would be much more likely to accept her as the rightful queen of Egypt. And from the looks of things, it worked like a charm. Soon after Cleopatra's magnificent procession, Mark Antony proposed a toast to her, calling her the new Isis. Isis was the chief goddess of the Egyptian pantheon, a mother goddess and the consort of Osiris, the god of the Nile. So you can imagine that Cleopatra felt honored by the comparison. But not everyone was happy with the relationship between Mark Antony and Cleopatra. And in 40 BC, Caesar's adopted son and heir, Octavian aka Augustus, went to war with Antony, starting a conflict known as the Alexandrian War. But that, my friends, is a story for another day. Join us next week for part 2 of our series, where we will continue the tale of Cleopatra and bring you up to speed on the events leading up to her legendary confrontation with Augustus. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode.